Today we're interviewing the tribal headmen of the Chautauqua Gathering, all related in one way or another to the Lanfer family that introduced us to Chautauqua. The legacies of Lee Lanfer, Margaret Lyon, and Bernice Lanfer, and especially their love of family, lives on strong and deep. However, there are some stories and details yet unknown. Today we hope to uncover some of them and learn more about the current patriarchs of the family. As far as official relationships, Jerry Chichester was married to Jean Lanfer, daughter of Lee Lanfer, the eldest son of the Lanfer family. Wayne Lyon is the oldest son of Margaret Lanfer Lyon, and Blair Leroy was married to Jane Lyon Leroy, Margaret's daughter. Everyone adored Aunt Bernice either for her wit and humor or her complete uniqueness, and came most summers to stay at the legendary Chautauqua Inn. Wayne, how did Chautauqua become part of the family?
Well, the history of it goes back to the turn of the century when the Lanfer family, which were born and brought up in Latonia, Ohio, later in Salem, Ohio, about 100 odd miles from here. The two older girls, Ruth and Margaret, came here to the Athenaeum to waitress in their teens. And they did that for several summers, during which time they served such notables as Thomas Alva Edison and many others, and that became the root of the Chautauqua experience. After Ruth Margaret came Bernice, and later on Mary and Ida Mae. All of them came here and were part of the Chautauqua experience over their early lives. They came back here later as married women or single women in the case of Aunt Bernice, and couldn't get Chautauqua out of their system.
All right, well, why don't we take a moment and have you gentlemen introduce one another and how you first came to meet. So, Wayne, if you would take a moment and introduce Blair to us, that would be great, please.
Well, Blair was the first young man that I thought was worthy of my sister. It took some 3 dozen, I think, I went through without my approval before I came across Blair Leroy, who was a Yale graduate. Not he was going to Yale when I first met him, and Jane was going to Connecticut College. And I thought so much of him that I named one of my sons after him. We have a Blair Barton Lyon in our family, and after Blair Leroy.
Terrific. And Blair, if you would introduce Jerry and how you came to know him, please.
I first met Jerry, as I recall, at Chautauqua. I don't think I'd ever met that side of the family until Jerry came with Jean, and it was our first year or two experience here when we all came with overloaded cars full of boats, bicycles, etc., and little kids coming out from every corner of the car. We met at the Chautauqua Inn and immediately gelled into a lot of fun and a lot of great times together.
And Jerry, can you describe how you came to meet Wayne?
Indeed, I can. Your mother, Jean, was always unhappy about not having had brothers and sisters. 1960, when we were getting married, she wanted to get the closest equivalent to a brother or sister that she could find to be in the wedding. And so she prevailed on me to ask Wayne if he would participate. And so I met him September 10th, I guess it was, or maybe the 9th, 1960. And he was as impressive then as he is now.
I believe that. So,
Hi, I'm Marlise Edwards, and my grandpa's Jerry Chichester. The thing I enjoy most about Jerry Chichester is when I go up to his lake house and we splash in the water, we go skiing, and he takes us out to eat a lot. And it is very delicious.
My name is Nicholas Lyon, and my grandfather is Wayne Lyon. What I like most about him is his friendly greeting. He always greets me so happy and excited, and he always says these same words, "Hey, Nico," and I always love that when he says that. But he can be really tough, and I'm kind of glad he does that, because or else I would get kind of soft and hope on my parents to keep me running. So he's the best grandfather I've ever had.
And my grandpa is Blair. And what I remember most...
So let's go back a little ways, and maybe you can educate the family a little bit on your early years. Blair, if you can tell us a little bit about your childhood and where you grew up, please.
I grew up in southern Ohio in a town named Franklin, Ohio, which interestingly was 3 miles away from Chautauqua, Ohio, which at that time was a model of the Chautauqua, New York. And it had been for a number of years. It had a grand hotel, it had a dock at the Great Miami River, nothing quite like the Chautauqua Lake. It had a plaza in which there were stores and shops. It had a grand dining area with dinners that were sort of fairly similar to the Athenaeum. There was a large amphitheater, probably half the size of the Chautauqua, New York amphitheater. And we went there, if you can believe this, 3 miles away from our very nice home in Ohio, and lived in a cottage all summer long. And it was a rule we could not go back to our home 3 miles away. And I remember as I can't think, 6, 7, 8-year-old, I got on my bicycle and I rode all the way to our home, and I was chastised because I went back to the home, and I thought it was such an accomplishment to ride my bike 3 miles back and forth. But I grew up there, had 2 friends, we were just buddies, we did everything together, we had boats, we had swimming, and we all ended up being lifeguards at the great swimming pool. It was a unique experience. There were speakers, and one of which I remember was Eleanor Roosevelt. Another I remember was Amy Semple McPherson, who was an evangelist woman who brought people from cripples to walking right on the stage. And we were quite amazed at her amazing capabilities through religion to make cripples walk. Later to be found out this was quite a fraud, but, but we were quite astounded as children seeing these things happen at Chautauqua. So that was where I spent a lot of my early years in the summertime.
Great. And Wayne, can you share a little bit about your childhood, please?
Well, I was born and brought up in Dayton, Ohio, Oakwood, a suburb actually, and came up here in my early years, certainly when I was 4 or 5, 6, 7, because Mother would come up and help Aunt Bernice. At that time, she was running the Mayflower Tea Room, which was before the Chautauqua Inn, which was mentioned earlier. She bought the Chautauqua Inn some years later, and then she had the whole inn to take care of. But she originally started as a tea room operator, and her background was in food. She ran cafeterias for the Cleveland school system, as well as taught in later years. But so Mother would come up here, and I would just tag along, and Jane, my sister, and I was doing such interesting things as dropping water balloons off of the 2nd story onto the ladies down below. I never hit anybody. It wasn't for want of trying. And caught my first pike up here, and so it had a lot of fond memories. Our drill back then, and it still was when my family started coming here, the young people had to go to the first half of any lecture, symphony, whatever it was, ballet going on in the amphitheater. If they went to the first half, they'd get ice cream. Didn't have to go to the second half if they didn't want to. But that's a rule that's prevailed, I don't know, for 50 or 60 years, Jerry. That was our deal with our young people. They had to go half the time, and then they could get rewarded.
I'm getting complaints about the ice cream having fallen off the agenda.
But that was the early years up here, and we should probably each say a little bit about our background, just as we went. I went to Cranbrook from the 8th to the 12th grade, which was a preparatory school in Bluefield Hills, Michigan, and from there on to University of Cincinnati. Got a chemical engineering degree. Went into the plastics business with Union Carbide Corporation. Later went to the Connex division of Illinois Tool Works, and was, through successive jobs over a 10-year period, became manager of business development, finally vice president of business development for Illinois Toolworks. And at 39, I went over to Detroit to Masco Corporation, where I stayed for the rest of my career as president and chief operating officer of Masco Corporation. Retired at 70 after a little extracurricular. I played a few more holes on the back nine of life, taking $2 billion worth of furniture companies private for 5 years. But ended up at 70, retired, and I'm into personal pursuits, one of which is Chautauqua.
Outstanding. Jerry, can you share a little bit about where you grew up in your childhood?
Certainly. I was born in Akron, Ohio, to a father who had grown up in Georgia but had gone to work for Goodyear in Akron in 1929. And by being in Akron, he became acquainted with my mother, who lived in Cleveland, and we lived in Hudson, which is approximately halfway between Akron and Cleveland. And I lived there until I was about 8. And then the large corporate culture didn't fit my father's style very well. And the war was over, so he was no longer frozen in his job. So even though he was an engineer, he studied pharmacy, and his brother was a pharmacist and drugstore entrepreneur in Georgia. So we uprooted ourselves in 1946, or I had nothing to do with the uprooting. Moved to Georgia, and I lived there till graduating from high school in a succession of homes that directly reflected the prosperity or lack of prosperity of the drugstore. And I went to school at the University of North Carolina, which actually I hadn't really thought about this. Does lead into the Chautauqua experience, because Duke and University of North Carolina are only about 6 or 7 miles apart. And UNC has no women in the first 2 or 3 years, so you have to find greener pastures. Duke was a greener pasture, and Gene Lanford was at Duke, and that's how we met. And the rest of the connections, maybe I'll explain later.
Excellent. They're wonderful, strong, interesting women that were involved in some fashion with Chautauqua. Are there any stories or perspective on your mothers that you'd care to share with the rest of the family?
I'll mention that because we, as a family, went to Chautauqua in Ohio, that was a very important part of our life. And my mother was on the, I remember, was very involved, probably more my father, because my father was always working business oriented. Though I think he was on the board of directors at one time. My mother was on a speakers bureau, and I'll tell one story that she was the, I guess she was the chair of the speakers bureau when Eleanor Roosevelt came to speak at Chautauqua, Ohio. My father was a very adamant Republican, and in those days Roosevelt was a dirty word, and so Eleanor Roosevelt was invited to speak at Chautauqua, Ohio, and she had about a half hour of downtime before her speaking was to occur. She spent that time at our house. And when my father's friends heard about this, he was almost booted out of the party. But she was very active in that, and in her later years, we invited her to come here, and she spent, I think, one time with us here, maybe twice, but she fell in love with this place. She just wished she had known it earlier in her life and would come here, but she lived in Florida at the time. It was a big trip, but she loved seeing this Chautauqua and compared to the Chautauqua that she knew as a